A kind-hearted young woman saves an elderly janitor from being humiliated, not knowing that she's the CEO's mother. This changes her life. Spilled coffee dripped slowly down the marble table as debauched laughter echoed through the elegant surroundings of Skyline Coffee, located on the 45th floor of Chicago's imposing Reynolds Tower. Zoe Franklin watched the scene with her hands shaking with indignation, while a gray-haired lady in a light blue uniform tried to clean up the mess purposely caused by a group of executives. "Maybe if you weren't so slow, you wouldn't have to clean up so much," sneered one of them, adjusting his Italian silk tie with a smug smile. Zoe, who had just entered the cafeteria for her usual breakfast before work, felt her blood boil. As an assistant editor of Pristine Publishing, a few floors down, she knew the type well: executives who confuse status with human value. "Excuse me," Zoe approached, her firm voice cutting through the air. "Could you please show a little respect? This lady is doing her job." Silence overtook the room. The lady, Martha Reynolds, as her badge indicated, stood still with a cleaning cloth in her hand, her kind eyes wide with surprise. "In your?" asked another executive, arching a perfectly trimmed eyebrow. "Someone who knows the difference between professional success and character," replied Zoe, keeping her gaze steady. Her dark brown curls framed a determined face that showed no fear. What Zoe didn't know was that, through the building's security cameras, Maxwell Reynolds was watching the scene unfold in his penthouse office. His blue-gray eyes fixed on the monitor as he watched someone finally defend his mother. Martha had always insisted on keeping her job as a janitor, even after Max had turned a small tech startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire. "Money changes the world around us, son," she used to say, "but it shouldn't change who we are." In the cafe, the executives began to disperse, muttering insincere apologies. Zoe helped Martha clear up the rest of the coffee, ignoring the curious looks from the other customers. "Thank you, dear," Martha smiled, her wrinkles deepening with genuine gratitude. "You needn't have bothered." "Of course I did," Zoe replied, returning the smile. Zoe Franklin. I come here every morning, and I always admire how you keep this place spotless." "Martha," she introduced herself without mentioning her surname. "You're the first person in a long time who's actually seen me." From the penthouse, Maxwell continued to watch. At 35, he had built a tech empire, but he rarely witnessed gestures of genuine kindness like that, especially towards his mother, who insisted on keeping her identity a secret. Over the next few days, Zoe and Martha developed a friendship. Every morning, Zoe arrived a little early to chat with the janitor. Martha shared stories of her 40 years of work, while Zoe talked about her dreams of becoming a renowned publisher. "You know, Martha, sometimes I wonder if I'm not dreaming too big," Zoe confessed one morning, stirring her coffee with a spoon. "The publishing world is so competitive." "Dreams don't have ceilings, dear," Martha replied, her words carrying a wisdom that only experience brings. "And you have something that many don't, a heart that sees beyond appearances." Maxwell, who had developed the habit of following these morning interactions, found himself increasingly intrigued by Zoe Franklin. She was different from the people who usually surrounded him, always looking for favors or connections. Zoe displayed a rare authenticity, especially in a corporate environment. In her office at Pristine Publishing, Zoe struggled to concentrate on her work. The pile of manuscripts on her desk seemed to grow by the day, but her thoughts kept returning to Martha. The night before, she had witnessed another incident in the cafeteria when an impatient customer had yelled at the janitor over an accidental spill. "You don't deserve that," Zoe had said afterwards, offering Martha a tissue to dry her eyes. "Life isn't always fair, dear," Martha had replied with a sad smile, "but we find light in the people who cross our path." What neither of them knew was that Maxwell Reynolds was developing a plan. How could he get close to Zoe without revealing that he had been watching her? How could he explain that the janitor she showed so much respect for was actually her mother? The answer began to form when he noticed one of the manuscripts Zoe was carrying, a story about second chances and redemption. Perhaps, he thought, the way to get close to her was through her work, her passion for literature. Maxwell knew he was treading on dangerous territory. As CEO of Reynolds Technologies, his actions were constantly scrutinized by the media. One false move and the whole thing could come crashing down, exposing not only his interest in Zoe, but also the secret that his mother was guarding so zealously. Meanwhile, in the cafe, Zoe was still the only person who treated Martha like a human being worthy of respect and attention. She had no idea that her actions were about to trigger a series of events that would change her life forever. Sometimes, Martha had commented that morning, while clearing a nearby table, the greatest love stories begin in the most unlikely places. Zoe laughed, thinking that Martha was just being romantic. Little did she know that, 35 floors up, a man who ran a tech empire was beginning to believe exactly the same thing. The morning after the incident at the cafe, Zoe arrived at Reynolds Tower earlier than usual. Her hands firmly clutched a small brown paper bag containing 2 blueberry muffins, a small gesture to cheer Martha up after the previous difficult day. However, when she entered Skyline Coffee, she found only silence and a handwritten note on the door, closed for emergency maintenance. Frowning, Zoe checked her watch. It was 7:15 in the morning. The cafe never closed, especially during the morning rush hour. Her heart squeezed at the thought of Martha. Was it possible that the recent incidents had resulted in some consequences for the kindly janitor? Determined not to waste the muffins, Zoe opted to explore other floors of the building in search of coffee. On the 47th floor, she discovered a small, hidden cafe with a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. The place was practically empty, except for a man in an impeccable navy blue suit sitting by the window, engrossed in his laptop. "Welcome to Summit Brew," a smiling barista greeted her. "First time here?" "Yes," Zoe replied, her eyes still roaming the cozy atmosphere. "Skyline Coffee is closed today." "Ah yes, problems with the ventilation system, I hear," the barista explained as she prepared Zoe's order, a cappuccino with almond milk. As she waited, Zoe couldn't help but notice that the man by the window occasionally glanced in her direction. There was something familiar about him, although she couldn't pinpoint what. Perhaps he was just another of the countless executives who circulated through the building every day. "Here's your coffee," the barista announced, interrupting her thoughts. "Would you like a table?" Before Zoe could answer, a male voice sounded behind her. "You can sit here if you like. The view is spectacular." It was a man with a laptop. Up close, Zoe noticed his blue-gray eyes that seemed charged with a peculiar intensity. He smiled, and something in his smile made her accept the invitation. "Maxwell," he introduced himself, holding out his hand. "Zoe Franklin," she replied, settling into the chair opposite. "I work at Pristine Publishing, a few floors down." Maxwell nodded, as if he already knew this information. "Publisher then?" "Editorial assistant," actually, Zoe corrected, taking one of the muffins out of the bag. "Still trying to make a name for myself on the market." She offered the other muffin to Maxwell, who accepted it with a surprised smile. "And how is this journey going?" he asked, sounding genuinely interested. For some reason that Zoe couldn't explain, she found herself sharing her aspirations with this stranger. She talked about her dreams of publishing stories that made a difference, about the difficulties of standing out in such a competitive market. "You know," Maxwell commented, after listening attentively, "sometimes the best stories are right in front of our eyes. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things." Zoe immediately thought of Martha. "Yes, like standing up for someone when no one else would," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Maxwell watched her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Exactly," he replied softly. The conversation flowed naturally, and before they knew it, almost an hour had passed. Zoe discovered that Maxwell was involved in technology, although he was vague about the specific details of his work. "I have to go," Zoe announced, checking her watch ruefully. "I have a meeting in 10 minutes. "It's been a pleasure, Zoe," Maxwell smiled, standing up politely as she prepared to leave. "Maybe we'll meet again around here?" "Maybe," she replied with a small smile, although she doubted it. Summit Brew seemed to be frequented by a more exclusive circle of executives. Back at her desk at Pristine Publishing, Zoe couldn't stop thinking about the strange morning she'd had. She worried about Martha and, at the same time, found herself remembering her conversation with Maxwell. There was something about him, a veiled kindness, a genuine curiosity, that intrigued her. What Zoe didn't know was that, at that very moment, Maxwell was in his penthouse office, reviewing the security cameras from the cafe over the last few days. He watched the way Zoe treated her mother, how her face lit up when she talked to Martha, how fiercely she defended those whom others ignored. "How was the meeting?" Martha asked as she entered her son's office for their secret daily lunch. "It wasn't a date, Mom," Maxwell replied, quickly closing the security screens. "It was an orchestrated coincidence." Martha laughed, her eyes sparkling with wisdom. "Son, nothing in this building happens by coincidence, especially when you're involved." Maxwell sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "She's different, Mom. Genuine. I can't just walk up and say, 'Hey, I'm the CEO of the building, and I've been watching you defend my mother, who pretends to be just a janitor.' Then find another way," Martha suggested, helping herself to the lunch they had ordered. "But remember, the longer you wait, the harder it will be to explain all this later." Maxwell knew his mother was right. He needed to find a way to get closer to Zoe without compromising his mother's secret or looking like a corporate stalker. The solution began to form in his mind when he noticed a memo on his desk. Pristine Publishing was looking for investors for a new publishing line focused on stories of social transformation. Perhaps, he thought, there was a way to unite the worlds of technology and literature, creating an opportunity not only to get closer to Zoe, but also to help her realize her publishing dreams. What he didn't imagine was that his plans were about to become complicated in ways that not even all his business power could control. The morning after their meeting at Summit Brew, Zoe found a brown envelope on her desk at Pristine Publishing. Inside was a manuscript with a sticky note. "We need a second opinion. Top priority. Catherine Walsh, editor-in-chief." Her heart raced. Catherine Walsh rarely asked editorial assistants for their opinion, especially on priority projects. The manuscript, entitled Masks of Success, told the story of a businessman who lived a double life in order to better understand his employees. As she flipped through the pages, Zoe couldn't help but think of Maxwell. There was something familiar about the way the book's protagonist moved between different social worlds. She shook her head, pushing the thought away. It was unlikely that she would meet him again. During her lunch break, Zoe went down to Skyline Coffee, relieved to see that it was running smoothly. Martha was clearing the tables with her usual serene smile. "Martha, I was worried about you yesterday." Zoe approached, noticing something different about the lady's countenance. "Is everything all right?" "Oh dear." Martha smiled, her eyes twinkling in a mysterious way. "Sometimes things aren't exactly as they seem, but everything is perfectly fine." Before Zoe could question the meaning of that enigmatic reply, her phone vibrated. It was an email from an unknown address. m.reynolds@reynoltech.com. "Ms. Franklin, I'd like to discuss a potential partnership between Reynolds Technologies and Pristine Publishing. Can we meet today at 3 p.m. at Summit Brew? Sincerely, Maxwell Reynolds." Zoe almost dropped the phone. Maxwell Reynolds, the CEO of Reynolds Technologies, owner of the building where she worked. The same man she had shared muffins and dreams with the morning before. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Martha commented, watching her intently. I just found out that I had coffee with Maxwell Reynolds yesterday," Zoe replied, still dazed. "And he wants to meet me today." Martha disguised a smile, continuing to clear the tables. "Sometimes the most important meetings seem like coincidences, don't they?" At 2:55 p.m., Zoe went up to the Summit Brew, her hands sweating slightly as she held the manuscript she was revising. She decided to take it with her as a kind of shield, something to occupy her hands and mind. Maxwell was already there, wearing a gray suit that highlighted his eyes. When he saw her, he stood up with a smile that seemed to mix guilt and expectation. "Miss Franklin," he began, but Zoe interrupted him. "Why didn't you mention who you were yesterday?" Her voice came out firmer than she had expected. Maxwell indicated a chair and then sat down. "Because for the first time in a long time, someone talked to me without expectations or pretensions. It was refreshing." Zoe studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation, but found only sincerity. "In this meeting, is it really about a partnership?" "Yes and no," Maxwell admitted, ordering 2 coffees from the barista. "Reynolds Technologies is really interested in investing in innovative digital publishing." But he paused, choosing his words carefully. I also want an excuse to talk to you again. Why? Zoe asked, her curiosity momentarily overcoming her indignation. Maxwell hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly to the manuscript in her hands. Because you see people, Zoe. You really do. It's rare to find someone like that, especially in this corporate environment. The conversation flowed into professional aspects, with Maxwell explaining his vision for a digital publishing platform that would democratize access to literature. Zoe found herself involved, contributing ideas and perspectives on the publishing market. There's something else I need to confess, Maxwell said as the meeting drew to a close. His face took on a tense expression, but before he could continue, his phone rang. It was an urgent message about a problem with the company's servers. Sorry, we need to continue this conversation at another time. He stood up, visibly frustrated by the interruption. Can I email you more details about the project? Zoe nodded, watching him leave hastily. There was something unspoken hanging in the air, a truth that Maxwell seemed to struggle to reveal. Back at her desk, Zoe couldn't concentrate. The Masks of Success manuscript seemed to mock her with its coincidences. Her cell phone vibrated again. Another message from Maxwell. About today, there's a lot more I need to tell you. Have dinner with me tomorrow? Zoe looked out of her office window, watching the afternoon sun reflect off Chicago's buildings. Something was happening, something bigger than a simple business proposal. Her intuition screamed that Maxwell Reynolds held secrets that could change everything. After a few minutes of contemplation, she replied, Okay, but this time, I want the whole truth. On the cleaning floor, Martha was putting her uniform away in the small cupboard designated for employees. Her phone rang. It was Maxwell. She's agreed to have dinner with me tomorrow, he said, his voice a mixture of anxiety and relief. And you're going to tell her everything? Martha asked, even though she already knew the answer. I have to, Mom, before she finds out on her own and thinks we're two manipulative madmen. Martha smiled, thinking of how fate had curious ways of bringing people together. Sometimes, she said softly, the hardest truth to reveal is the one wrapped in gut intentions. The Altitude restaurant on the 60th floor of the Franklin Building was known for its breathtaking views of Chicago and its months-long waiting list. However, Maxwell Reynolds had managed to get a table that night. One of the advantages of being who he was, although that thought bothered him now more than ever. Zoe arrived punctually at 7 p.m., wearing a simple navy blue dress she had bought at a sale the previous year. Her hair was tied up in a casual bun, a few unruly curls framing her face. As she entered the restaurant, she immediately filled out a place among the designer dresses and Italian suits. Ms. Franklin, the maitre d' greeted her with a soft bow. Mr. Reynolds is waiting for you. Maxwell stood up as he saw her approach, his eyes revealing a mixture of admiration and apprehension. You look lovely, he said softly, pulling out the chair for her. Thank you, Zoe replied, trying to keep her composure as she took in the luxurious surroundings. Although I do feel a bit like an insider here. You'd be surprised how many people here feel exactly like that, Maxwell commented, an enigmatic smile on his lips. Including me sometimes. The sommelier approached with a bottle of red wine. But before he could make his elaborate presentation, Zoe interrupted. Water, please. I need to keep my mind clear for this conversation. Maxwell nodded, dismissing the sommelier with a polite gesture. You're right. Clarity is exactly what we need tonight. So, Zoe began, her fingers drumming lightly on the table. What are these truths you need to tell me? Maxwell took a deep breath, settling his napkin in his lap, a gesture that betrayed his nervousness. Where to start? First, I have to admit that our meeting at Summit Brew wasn't exactly a coincidence. I figured, Zoe replied, keeping her voice calm despite her racing heart. Skyline Coffee never closes for maintenance. No, it doesn't, he agreed. I've been watching you for some time, Zoe, through the building's security cameras. The waiter arrived with the menus, but Zoe barely noticed him. Why? Because of the way you treat Martha, Maxwell replied, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Because of the way you defend her, the way you talk to her every morning, the way you make her smile. Martha, Zoe repeated, starting to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Is there something about her I should know? Maxwell closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his courage. Martha Reynolds is my mother. The silence that followed was deafening. Zoe felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The conversations at the neighboring tables seemed distant, as if they were taking place in another universe. Your mother, she finally managed to say. The janitor who suffers daily harassment from arrogant executives is your mother. And you just watch? It's not that simple, Maxwell hastened to explain. It was her choice to keep her job. Believe me, I've tried 1,000 times to convince her to retire, but she insists that her job keeps her connected to reality, that it prevents her from losing herself in the privilege that my success has brought. Zoe picked up her glass of water, taking a long sip as she processed the information. Why didn't she ever tell me? For the same reason, she keeps it a secret from everyone, Maxwell explained. She doesn't want to be treated differently. She doesn't want people to see her as the CEO's mother. She just wants to be Martha. And you decided to tell me now because you see her exactly as she wants to be seen, as a person worthy of respect, regardless of her position. And because he paused, carefully choosing his next words, because I fell in love with the way you see the world. The waiter returned, eager to take their orders, but Maxwell dismissed him again with a gentle gesture. So, all that talk about partnerships between companies? It's real, Maxwell assured him. The business proposal is genuine. But you're right to think it was also an excuse to approach me. Zoe leaned back in her chair, watching the city light up through the restaurant windows. You know what's ironic? The manuscript I'm reviewing is about a businessman living a double life. Actually, Maxwell smiled shyly. It's not that ironic. I may have had something to do with it arriving on your desk. Oh my God, Zoe muttered, bringing her hands to her face. How much more? What else did you orchestrate? Just that, I swear, Maxwell answered quickly. Everything else, your interactions with my mother, our conversation at Summit Brew was genuine. I just created some opportunities. You realize how scary that is, don't you? Zoe questioned, although her voice didn't carry anger, just cautious curiosity. I do, he admitted, and I feel terrible about it. But I also realized that the longer I waited to tell the truth, the worse it would be. Silence hung between them again, filled only by the distant sounds of cutlery and conversations around them. Finally, Zoe spoke up. Does Martha know you're telling me all this? It was her idea, Maxwell laughed softly. She said I was being a romantic fool, trying to create elaborate dates when I could just be honest. A small smile appeared on Zoe's lips. That sounds like something she'd say. So, Maxwell leaned over the table slightly. Now that you know everything, the big question is, do you still want to have dinner with me? Zoe studied the man in front of her, the powerful CEO who orchestrated elaborate meetings, who watched your mother through security cameras, who seemed simultaneously safe and vulnerable. Yes, she finally answered, but on one condition. What? The next time I defend your mother against some arrogant executive, you have to show up in person to put on a show of authority. I'm tired of doing it myself. Maxwell's smile lit up his entire face. Agreed. Now, can we finally order dinner? I'm starving. Of course, Zoe smiled back. And Maxwell, thank you for trusting me with the truth. What neither of them knew was that, at that very moment, Martha Reynolds was watching the scene from her small house in the suburbs, smiling as she held a cup of tea. Sometimes, she thought, it takes a little maternal manipulation to bring together two souls who were born to meet. The day after the revealing dinner at Altitude, Zoe arrived early at Skyline Coffee, her heart beating to a different rhythm at the sight of Martha. The janitor was at her usual post, but now every little detail about her seemed to scream, Maxwell Reynolds' mother. Good morning, dear. Martha smiled, that same gentle smile that Zoe had known for weeks, but which now carried a new meaning. So, Zoe began adjusting the strap of her bag. I think we have a lot to talk about. Martha put her cleaning cloth aside and guided Zoe to a more private table. Max told me about dinner. I imagine you have questions. Why are you still here? Zoe asked directly. Why put up with disrespect when you could be living in a mansion on the Gold Coast? Martha added with a soft laugh. Darling, let me tell you a story. When Max was little, We lived in a tiny apartment on the south side. I worked 3 different jobs to keep him in school. One of them was here, in this very building, although at the time it had another name. Zoe watched as Martha lost herself in memories, her wrinkled hands intertwined on the table. Every evening, Max would sit in our little kitchen and show me his drawings of computers and circuits. He was only 12, but he was already dreaming of creating something revolutionary. And you know what he always said? "One day, Mom, I'm gonna buy this whole building so you don't have to clean it anymore." And he did it, Zoe murmured, impressed. Yes, he did, but when the time came, I realized that I didn't want to stop. This job is not just about clearing tables or serving coffee. It's about keeping our feet on the ground, about remembering where we came from, and above all, about recognizing the value of each person, regardless of their position. The cafe was beginning to fill up as executives hurriedly queued for their breakfast. Martha watched the movement with a knowing smile. Besides, she continued, how could I have met you if I'd been at home playing bridge with the ladies of the club? Zoe blushed, suddenly remembering something. Did you know the whole time that Maxwell was watching me on camera? Of course I knew, Martha laughed. My son may be a technological genius, but he's still as transparent as glass to me. I saw how his eyes lit up every time he mentioned you during our lunches. You have lunch together? Every day, in his office. It's our little secret ritual. Well, not so secret now. Just then, Zoe's cell phone vibrated with a message from Maxwell. Looking at you two now, you seem to be having an interesting conversation. Zoe looked up, searching for the cameras discreetly installed in the ceiling, and typed back, "Stalker." The answer came instantly. "Guilty. But I have official permission to watch now, don't I?" "He's watching us now, isn't he?" Martha asked, recognizing the smile on Zoe's face. "Yes. Apparently, it's a hard habit to break." You know, Martha leaned forward, lowering her voice. Ever since his father left us when Max was only 5, he's developed this need to protect the people he loves. The cameras, the monitoring, it's his way of keeping everyone safe. Zoe felt her heart squeeze. He's never mentioned his father. He doesn't. Richard was a brilliant but unstable man. He preferred pursuing his dreams in California to staying with his family in Chicago. The last time we heard from him was 10 years ago, when he tried to get in touch after Reynolds Technologies became successful. And what happened? Max received him in his office, listened to his investment proposal, and politely informed him that he didn't mix business with past abandonments. The cafe was completely full now, the buzz of conversation filling the room. Martha stood up, returning to her role as janitor. "Martha," Zoe called out softly, "thank you for sharing this with me. Darling, you're the first person in a long time who has seen the value in a simple janitor. And the first one who made my son forget his security cameras and really live in the moment." Martha paused, her eyes shining with wisdom. "Just promise you'll be patient with him. Behind the powerful CEO, there's still that 12-year-old boy drawing circuits in our little kitchen." Zoe nodded, feeling the weight of Martha's trust in her. Her phone vibrated again with another message from Maxwell. "Dinner tonight? I promise not to choose such a pretentious place." Looking at Martha, who was now clearing a nearby table with her usual serene smile, Zoe replied, "How about you cook for me? I hear there's an interesting kitchen somewhere in this building." The answer took a few seconds. "Brave. Just don't tell my mom I'm going to try to cook. She's still not over the pasta incident of 2019. Zoe laughed, putting her phone away and getting ready for work. As she walked to the elevator, she realized that she was entering something much bigger than a simple corporate romance story. He was entering a story about family, overcoming, and second chances. A story that, curiously, began with a spilled cup of coffee and a janitor who wasn't just a janitor. The aroma of something burning filled the penthouse apartment as Zoe stepped out of the private elevator. Maxwell, wearing an apron over his partially unbuttoned dress shirt, was covertly trying to open the windows while waving the smoke away with a dishcloth. "Welcome to the culinary disaster of 2024, he smiled ungraciously, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I guess I should have mentioned that my talent in the kitchen is inversely proportional to my success in business." Zoe couldn't help laughing when she saw the powerful CEO of Reynolds Technologies looking so out of place in his own kitchen. "Why didn't you ask your mother for help?" "Because," Maxwell replied, turning off the extractor fan, "I wanted to impress you all by myself." Clearly, it was a miscalculation. The kitchen was a sight to behold, dirty pans piled up in the sink, ingredients scattered across the marble counter, and something unrecognizable in the oven that was probably supposed to be the main course. "You know," Zoe began, taking off her coat, "there's a reason why CEOs have private chefs." "Actually, I have one," Maxwell admitted, turning off the oven. "But I thought it would be more authentic to cook myself. My mother always says that the best conversations happen in the kitchen." "Speaking of your mother," Zoe began to roll up her sleeves, "we had an interesting conversation this morning." Maxwell tensed for a moment. "Did she mention my father?" "Yes," Zoe replied softly, moving closer to him. "And she also mentioned a certain pasta incident in 2019 that you preferred not to detail." The relief on his face was visible. "Oh, that? Let's just say that some fire alarms were triggered and several executives had to evacuate the building during an important meeting." As he spoke, Maxwell began to take what was left of the failed dinner out of the oven. Zoe watched his hands that commanded a technological empire, but trembled slightly when handling a burnt form. "How about we make something together?" she suggested, picking up an extra apron hanging near the fridge. "I promise not to tell anyone that the great Maxwell Reynolds needs help in the kitchen." "My reputation thanks you," he smiled, and for the first time that evening, he seemed truly relaxed. "What do you suggest?" "Well, I see you have basic ingredients here. How about a simple pasta? I promise we won't set off any fire alarms." As they worked side by side in the kitchen, the conversation flowed naturally. Maxwell told of his early years building Reynolds Technologies in a rented garage, while Zoe shared stories about peculiar manuscripts that arrived on her desk at the publishing house. "You know what's funny?" Zoe commented as she chopped tomatoes. "For weeks, I imagined stories about Martha's life outside of work. I could never have guessed the truth." "She has that effect on people," Maxwell replied, concentrating on not burning the garlic. "She manages to make everyone wonder about their own presumptions." "How do you deal with that? Seeing people treat your mother like that?" Maxwell paused, his face taking on a more serious expression. Difficulty. Every time I see someone being disrespectful, I want to go downstairs and reveal everything. But she made me promise not to interfere. She says she has to deal with it in her own way." "But you interfere in other ways," Zoe observed. "Like through the cameras." "The cameras started out as a security measure," he admitted. "Then they became a habit, a way of staying connected with her, even when I'm stuck in endless meetings." The dough began to take shape, and the aroma of fresh spices gradually replaced the smell of burning. Zoe noticed how Maxwell was watching her prepare the sauce, his eyes attentive to every movement. "What is it?" she asked, catching him by surprise. "I was thinking how ironic it is," he replied. "I've spent weeks watching you through cameras, and now I can't take my eyes off you in person." Zoe felt her cheeks flush. "Is that supposed to sound romantic or creepy? A bit of both?" Maxwell laughed, running his hand down his neck in a nervous gesture. "Sorry, I'm still learning to navigate all this. I'm usually much better at business negotiations than at, well, that. Zoe arched an eyebrow, trying to impress someone who already knows me in my most vulnerable moments, even before they really know me. The pasta was almost ready, and the apartment now smelled like a real Italian kitchen. Zoe began to set the table, noticing for the first time the spectacular view of Chicago through the apartment windows. "Your mother told me about the drawings," she commented softly. "About you creating circuits in the kitchen when you were a child." Maxwell stopped what he was doing, surprised. "She talked about that?" "Yes, about how you promised to buy this building for her. And yet she chose to keep cleaning it," he added, a sad smile on his lips. "Sometimes I wonder if she isn't trying to teach me a lesson with all this. Maybe the lesson is that real value has nothing to do with how much money you have or what position you hold," Zoe suggested, putting the last of the cutlery on the table. "As he demonstrated by defending a simple janitor from arrogant executives?" "Exactly," she smiled. "Although now I know I was defending the mother of my future boss." Maxwell almost dropped the plate he was holding. Your future boss? Well, if we're really going to make this partnership between Reynolds Technologies and Pristine Publishing happen. Oh yes, of course, he regained his composure, but Zoe noticed a slight blush on his cheeks. The partnership. The pasta was finally ready, and the two of them sat down to dinner. The food was surprisingly good, much better than Maxwell's initial attempt. So, Zoe began swirling the wine in her glass. Now that we're no longer keeping secrets from each other. Actually, Maxwell interrupted her gently. There's still one thing you need to know. There's still something you need to know. Maxwell's confession hung in the air like a dense cloud. Zoe placed her fork on the table, her heart racing slightly at the seriousness in her voice. The Masks of Success manuscript that arrived on your desk. He began adjusting his posture in his chair. It wasn't just my suggestion to Catherine Walsh. I wrote it. Zoe blinked several times, processing the information. You wrote a book? Actually, I've written several, Maxwell admitted, getting up to get something from his office. He returned with a thick folder. Under the pseudonym M.R. Stone, Catherine is the only one in Pristine who knows. Leafing through the folder, Zoe found drafts of stories, all exploring themes of identity, social masks, and redemption. Her hands trembled slightly as she recognized passages she had read and admired over the years. M.R. Stone, she murmured, the author of Codes of Silence and Paper Empire? Those books sold millions of copies, and no one ever found out who the author was, Maxwell added. Except Catherine, who caught me writing during a business meeting 5 years ago. She's been my secret editor ever since. Why keep it a secret? Maxwell stood up, walking over to the window. The city shone below, a carpet of lights that seemed to reflect the complexities of his life. When you grow up like I did, you learn that people have expectations about who you should be. CEO, entrepreneur, businessman, no one expects to find a writer behind that facade. Just like your mother chose to keep her job as a janitor, Zoe observed. Exactly, he smiled, returning to the table. I think I inherited from her this need to keep a part of me protected from the corporate world. And now, Maxwell took a deep breath. I want to unite these two worlds. The partnership between Reynolds Technologies and Pristine Publishing isn't just about business. It's about creating a platform where stories like mine, stories about people living double lives, facing social expectations, can find their space. That's why you wanted my opinion on Masks of Success, Zoe realized. It wasn't just about getting close to me. It was about finding someone who could see beyond appearances, he confirmed. Someone who would defend an unknown janitor with the same passion they would devote to a promising manuscript. Dinner grew cold between them, forgotten amid the revelations. Zoe picked up the folder again, studying the notes in the margins, ideas, corrections, loose thoughts that revealed the creative process behind the billionaire CEO. Does her mother know? She was the one who encouraged me to start writing. Maxwell smiled at the memory. After my father left us, I had frequent nightmares. She suggested I put my fears on paper, turn my pain into stories. And it worked. More than that, it became my way of processing the world. Every book I've written is an attempt to understand different aspects of life, power, identity, redemption. Zoe stood up, walking over to where Maxwell was standing. So you're not just a stalker CEO who watches people through security cameras. You're also a stalker writer who steals stories from real life. Maxwell laughed, the sound breaking the tension of the moment. When you put it like that, I sound even more disturbed. No, she touched his arm gently. You look more human. The touch sent an electric current through them both. For a moment, they stood there, close to the window, the glow of the city silently witnessing yet another layer being revealed. There's one more thing, Maxwell said softly. The new manuscript I'm writing is about a woman who sees beyond appearances and a man who hides his true nature behind security cameras. I'm curious to know how it ends, Zoe smiled. Me too, he replied, his eyes meeting hers. I'm still writing that chapter. The moment was interrupted by Maxwell's phone, a building security alert. He quickly checked the message, his face changing expression. What is it? My father. Maxwell replied, his voice tense. He's in the lobby, demanding to see me. Is Richard here? Zoe asked, remembering her conversation with Martha earlier. Yes, and from what the security guard described, he's not sober. Maxwell began to straighten his tie, instantly resuming his CEO posture. Sorry, I need to deal with this. I'll go with you, Zoe decided. You don't have to. Hey, she interrupted him. If you can watch me for weeks through cameras, I think I can return the favor by being present at a difficult time. Maxwell stopped, studying her face for a moment before nodding. As they descended in the private elevator, Zoe realized that she was about to witness yet another layer of Maxwell Reynolds' complex life. Not as the CEO, not as the secret writer, but as the son who still bore the scars of abandonment. The lobby of Reynolds Tower, normally silent at that time of night, was in a state of controlled tension. Richard Franklin, an older, worn-out version of Maxwell, staggered near the security desk, his loose tie and crumpled blazer contrasting with the elegance of the surroundings. "My son," he exclaimed when he saw Maxwell coming out of the elevator, his voice laced with alcohol. The great Maxwell Reynolds, too busy to answer his own father's calls. Zoe felt Maxwell stiffen beside her. Up close, the resemblance between father and son was undeniable. The same blue-gray eyes, although Richard's were clouded by years of wrong choices. "Mr. Franklin," Maxwell replied formally, his voice taking on the cold tone Zoe recognized from corporate meetings. "It's 9 in the evening. My office hours ended hours ago." "Business hours?" Richard laughed bitterly. "Is that how you treat family now? Like another appointment in your schedule?" The security guards kept a respectful distance, but Zoe could see their hands close to their radios, ready for any eventuality. Maxwell stepped forward, positioning himself subtly between Zoe and her father. "You lost the right to talk about family when you chose to abandon us," Maxwell declared, his voice low but charged with restrained emotion. "What do you want, Richard?" "I want to put things right." Richard staggered forward, leaning on a marble column. "I saw in the papers about Reynolds Technologies expanding into the European market. I thought maybe, perhaps you could take a ride on the success of the son you abandoned." A new voice cut through the air. Martha Reynolds emerged from the service elevator, still in her janitor's uniform. Her normally gentle eyes sparked with an intensity Zoe had never seen before. "Martha," Richard murmured, his face paling. "Are you still cleaning our son's building?" Martha added, approaching with firm steps. "Yes, because unlike you, Richard, some of us understand the real value of honest work." Zoe watched the family dynamic unfold like a scene from one of Maxwell's books. Martha, the janitor who chose to maintain her humility even after her son's success. Maxwell, the billionaire CEO who hid a sensitive writer behind the corporate facade. And Richard, the ghost from the past returning in search of redemption, or maybe just money. "I've made mistakes," Richard tried again, his voice breaking. "But I'm a different man now." "Different?" Maxwell laughed humorlessly. "The last time you said, that was 5 years ago, when you turned up asking for investment for your revolutionary startup. How much money did you lose this time, Dak?" Richard's silence was answer enough. "Max," Zoe touched his arm gently, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more private place." "There's nothing to talk about," Maxwell replied, but his eyes softened as they met hers. "Richard was just leaving." "You're just like me," Richard snapped, his voice laced with bitterness. "Building walls, hiding who you really are. At least I admit my faults." "No," Martha intervened, her voice cutting through the air like steel. "Max is everything you never were, Richard. He may have his secrets, but they're to protect what he loves, not to destroy." Zoe noticed Martha casting a meaningful glance in her direction, and understood. She knew about the books, about the cameras, about everything. "Security," Maxwell called out calmly. "Please escort Mr. Franklin out, and make sure he gets a cab safely." "This isn't over, Maxwell," Richard protested as he was gently led out. "We're family." "No, you Softy. Family is people who stay, who build together, who protect each other. You're just a poorly developed character in a story I finished writing a long time ago." When the glass doors closed behind Richard, the lobby fell into a heavy silence. Martha was the first to break it, placing a hand on her son's shoulder. "Are you all right?" Maxwell nodded, although Zoe could see the swirl of emotions in his eyes. "Sorry about the ruined dinner," he turned to her. "Hey," Zoe smiled softly, "we still have pasta left upstairs, and something tells me we could all use a good meal right now." "All of us?" Martha asked, arching an eyebrow. "Yes," Zoe replied firmly. "After all, someone needs to tell me more about this young man who drew circuits in the kitchen and dreamed of writing stories." Maxwell looked between the two most important women in his life. The mother who had never abandoned him, and the woman who was learning to see through all his layers. And for the first time that evening, a genuine smile lit up his face. "I think we need more wine," he commented as they walked to the elevator. "And you need cooking lessons," Martha added, making Zoe laugh. The trio went up to the penthouse, leaving the ghosts of the past in the lobby below. Sometimes, Zoe thought, the best stories aren't the ones we write, but the ones we live, with all their imperfections, revelations, and second chances. The soft light of dawn found Zoe awake in her Lincoln Park apartment, mentally going over the events of the night before. The impromptu dinner on the rooftop with Maxwell and Martha had gone late into the night, the stories flowing as naturally as the wine they shared. "I remember when he was 16, Martha had said, her eyes sparkling with memories. "I found dozens of notebooks hidden under his bed, all full of stories about a boy who built machines to mend broken hearts." Now, sitting on her small balcony with a cup of coffee, Zoe realized how those teenage stories had evolved into M.R. Stone's complex novels. Stories about people trying to mend not machines, but their own fragmented lives. Her phone vibrated with a message from Maxwell. "Emergency meeting at Pristine at 9 a.m. Catherine wants to discuss the partnership. I promise I didn't plan this." Zoe smiled, wondering how many coincidences in her life over the last few weeks had been truly unplanned. As she prepared for work, she reflected on how her own story had intertwined with the Reynolds in ways that no scriptwriter could have predicted. At Pristine Publishing, the mood was different. Staff were whispering in the corridors, casting curious glances in his direction. Apparently, the news that Reynolds Technologies was interested in a partnership had already spread, along with rumors about the editorial assistant who had caught the billionaire CEO's eye. Catherine Walsh was waiting for her in her living room, along with Maxwell and two Reynolds Technologies executives. "Zoe, I'm so glad you're here," the editor-in-chief smiled, indicating a chair. "We were just discussing how your editorial vision would be fundamental to this project." "My vision?" Zoe asked, taking a seat next to Maxwell, who maintained an impeccable professional expression. "Maxwell told us about his ideas for democratizing literature through technology," Catherine explained, "about how we could use Reynolds' platform to give a voice to stories that don't normally find space in the big publishing houses." Zoe cast a surprised glance at Maxwell. They had vaguely discussed these ideas over dinner, between stories about her childhood and confessions about her fears. "Actually," Maxwell interjected, "it was Zoe's unique perspective on human value and authenticity that inspired much of this project." The meeting continued with discussions about technical and financial aspects, but Zoe sensed something else going on beneath the surface. Maxwell wasn't just proposing a commercial partnership. He was creating a space where stories like his and his mother's could be told. After 2 hours of presentations and discussions, Catherine asked to speak to Zoe in private. Maxwell left the room with his executives, but not before casting a meaningful glance in her direction. "So," Catherine began as soon as they were alone, "how much do you know about M.R. Stone?" "Enough," Zoe answered carefully. "Well, as his editor for 5 years, I can tell you that I've never seen him so inspired." Catherine smiled, leaning back in her chair. "Your latest manuscript is unlike anything you've ever written. More personal, more real. Have you read Masks of Success?" "I have. And I also read the first chapters of the new book he started a few weeks ago. The one about the woman who sees beyond appearances." Catherine paused significantly. "You know it's about you, don't you?" Zoe felt her face heat up. "It's complicated." "Life usually is," Catherine agreed. "But rarely do we meet people who inspire us to be better versions of ourselves. When that happens, Zoe, it's worth the risk." The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and emails, but Zoe's mind kept returning to Maxwell's manuscripts, to the stories he had chosen to tell, and the ones he was still writing. In the late afternoon, she found Martha at Skyline Coffee, cleaning tables as usual. But something had changed, not in the way Martha worked, but in the way Zoe saw her. Not just as the courageous janitor she had defended, but as the woman who had single-handedly raised a son to become not just a successful CEO, but a man capable of seeing beauty in the untold stories. "He's upstairs, you know," Martha commented casually, indicating the ceiling with a shake of her head. "Probably writing. He always writes when he's processing strong emotions." "How did you know?" "About the books." "Right from the start." Martha smiled, that smile that carried decades of wisdom. "A mother always knows, dear. Besides, who do you think typed his first stories when he was still learning to use the computer?" Zoe laughed, imagining a young Maxwell dictating stories to his mother after work. "You never wanted to tell anyone?" "About being his mother, about the books." "Some secrets aren't about hiding," Martha replied, her gentle eyes meeting Zoe's. "They're about protecting something precious until you find the right people to share with." "And now," Martha smiled, "I think we found it." A week after the meeting at Pristine Publishing, Zoe found an envelope on her desk. Inside was an incomplete manuscript with a handwritten note. "Some stories need to be lived before they can be written." The pages contained the beginning of Maxwell's new book, the story about the woman who saw beyond appearances. Zoe recognized herself in the words, but she also saw something else. Martha's courage, Maxwell's complexity, the beauty of truths hidden in plain sight. Interesting reading. Maxwell's voice surprised her. He was standing in the doorway of her living room, more casual than she had ever seen him, wearing jeans and a light blue shirt. "Do you really intend to publish this?" Zoe asked, pointing to the manuscript. "It depends," he smiled, stepping inside and closing the door. "On the ending we're writing." The tension in the air was palpable, charged with unspoken words and unexplored possibilities. A week of professional meetings had kept a safe distance between them, but the manuscript broke down this carefully constructed barrier. "Your mother told me more about your first stories," Zoe said, standing up, "about the boy who wanted to build machines to mend broken hearts." "Martha was always my first and most important reader," Maxwell replied, moving closer. "She understood, before I did, that I didn't really need machines. I just needed to learn to be vulnerable." "How are you being vulnerable now?" "By sharing this story." "Terrifying," he admitted with a nervous smile, "but also liberating." Zoe's phone rang. It was Catherine, requesting her presence in the meeting room. When they got there, they found not only the editor-in-chief, but also Martha, wearing not her janitorial uniform, but an elegant navy blue ensemble. "You both needed to see this," Catherine smiled, turning on the big screen in the room. On the screen, a viral video showed Martha defending a young intern from an arrogant executive at Skyline Coffee. The scene had been captured by a customer and was circulating on social media with the hashtag #Zeladora. "Looks like I'm not the only one who inspires stories around here," Zoe commented, watching Martha in the video use the same firm and kind words that she herself had used weeks ago. "That's why we're here," Catherine continued. "This video gave us an idea. What if our first publication on the new platform was a series of real stories about people who make a difference in unexpected ways? Like a janitor who is secretly the CEO's mother," Martha suggested with a mischievous smile. "Or a billionaire CEO who writes novels under a pseudonym," Maxwell added. "Or an assistant editor who sees the extraordinary in the ordinary," Zoe added, meeting Maxwell's gaze. "Exactly," Catherine smiled. "Real stories about real people, showing that the greatest revelations happen in the most unlikely places." The meeting turned into a brainstorming session, with ideas flowing freely. Martha shared stories from her years observing life in the building. Maxwell talked about his literary inspirations, and Zoe contributed her editorial vision of how these narratives could touch people. "You know," Martha commented when they finally took a break, "when Max was little, he always said he wanted to build something that would last forever. I think I finally understand what he meant." "And what would that be?" Zoe asked. "Stories," Maxwell replied, his eyes meeting hers. Stories that remind people that we all have more layers than the world can see at first glance. That evening, after everyone had left, Zoe stayed in the meeting room, rereading Maxwell's unfinished manuscript. The last few pages were different, handwritten, still fresh. Some people spend their whole lives building walls, others specialize in seeing through them. The miracle happens when these people meet and discover that the best stories are the ones we write together. A movement at the door caught her eye. Maxwell was there, holding 2 Skyline coffee cups. "I thought we could write the next chapter," he said softly. "Together?" Zoe asked, although she already knew the answer. "Together," he confirmed, placing the coffees on the table and sitting down next to her. After all, the best stories are the ones that never really end. They just evolve in new directions. And so, under the soft lights of Chicago, with the scent of coffee in the air and the gentle sound of fingers on keyboards, a new story began to take shape. It wasn't just about a CEO and a publisher or a janitor with a secret. It was about all the little truths that make us human, all the masks we wear and drop, and all the extraordinary stories waiting to be discovered in the most ordinary places. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones we live while we think we're just watching life go by. And sometimes the truest love begins with a spilled cup of coffee and the courage to see beyond appearance.